when the abuse had come out, that I had grabbed her leg and I had begged her and I said, Mom, don't go, please don't go. And she said that she looked at me and she knew something was wrong, but she wasn't quite sure. And they had left to go to this restaurant and they had gotten to the parking lot. Apparently they got into the restaurant, and how my mother had described this is that she said, Kim, I just knew something was wrong. So I told your father. We got in the car and we drove home.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Attic. As many of you know, I do enjoy catching up with fellow ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-cult members, and today is no exception. I am delighted to be joined by Kim Ella Rae. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you.
So, Kim, as I understand it, you and I have something in common. That is a shared background with a group known as Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
How on earth did you get involved?
I was born into it. So,
Sure.
yes, I think we're very similar in some ways, just the way that we were both raised, as well as kind of just asking questions as you kind of got a little bit older and something just didn't quite add up. But at the end of the day, you do what you're taught and you think that it's the right thing. And you kind of grow up with a little bit of, sometimes for me anyways, was what's wrong with me? Why isn't this something that, I'm adopting the same? And I'm one of 6 children, and I have a twin brother who's an elder to this day. And, ever since I was really young, I started to kind of have these little questions and wonder, this isn't really something that I believe, but this is something that I, should believe. So what's wrong with me?
And of course, the mechanism that you're given when dealing with doubt is to wait on Jehovah, investigate it in the publications, and if it still doesn't make sense, either you need to just wait on Jehovah, or it's not a question that's worth asking. So
that's right. And really, it's not up to, when you're being raised like that, it's not up to me. Jehovah is the sovereign. He is the one to judge. And even with what happened to me, which I know that we're going to get into that a little bit, that had a huge impact on me, that, at the end of the day, Jehovah knows, because Jehovah knows everything will be okay. And I didn't feel like I had a voice from a very young age, because, at the end of the day, it was at least Jehovah knows. And that's exactly, what I believed in, and things changed as I got older.
Sure. So, to what extent, I mean, you've obviously described, a very devout little girl kind of growing up in the Jehovah's Witness religion. So to what extent were you involved kind of on a congregation level? I mean, obviously you're always limited as a woman.
Yeah.
There are many things that you can't do. But, to what extent were you involved in the preaching and that kind of thing?
So I'll go back to at least the point when I was 4 years old, right? And I'm kind of in the Kingdom Hall, and my father's an elder, my mother's a pioneer, I'm one of 6 kids. And my father always had a rule that the family had to sit in the first 3 rows in the middle. He was holding an example in the congregation. So I grew up with that, understanding that our family had a very pronounced way of kind of putting themselves in the congregation. And it was when I got older and I was talking to people said, nobody touched the Jewer family, because, we had this precedent. And so, when I was like 4 years old, I had this memory of kind of kicking my feet to the beat of my own tune and kind of, looking around, and I'm bored and I'm going through my book of Bible stories and I'm like, oh my gosh, and I'm falling asleep. And I got my dad pointing at me, with that finger that's like, stop, like, sit up, be proper. And so that's how I grew up. And so, when I got a little bit older, I felt the pressure, no different than anyone else, to get baptized. And it was not something I really wanted to do, but actually my twin brother wanted to be baptized more than I did. And, I talked to him about it later on in life. And I said, I kind of felt like I took a bullet for you. But at the end of the day, I did it, under the expectation. So when I was 14, I was baptized. And we had a precedent as a family that I needed to answer 3 times for every Sunday, at least put up my hand, whether I was asked or not. So I was very monitored. When I was 16, I was pulled out of school to do some homeschooling. And it was, at that point, you should want to be a pioneer. So you're 16 now and you've been baptized for a couple of years and being groomed for marriage. I was 15 years old and my mom has a box and it's Tupperware. And I was like, you're doing a Tupperware party? And she says, I have a whole box here for you. I'm like, why do I need Tupperware? She's like, well, when you get married, it's going to be a couple of years from now. And we're going to start getting stuff ready for you. And so she had a box that was in, I was like, I'm getting married. So I very much grew up in not only that world, but as a woman, that, really you're to assist a man, you're to get married, you're to, follow along, no different than what my mother did and pretty much all of her friends as well. Being one of 6 children, that was kind of the thing as well back then, was kind of like, you're going to have children. And that's basically, I never really thought beyond that, to tell you the truth.
Sorry, did you just say you were one of 6 children?
Yes, one of 6. Yes. I'm the youngest of 6 and I have a twin brother. And, I was kind of the feisty one. I was the cheeky one. I was the rebellious one.
Yeah.
And I certainly got myself into trouble probably and more than the rest of them in some ways, but that's how I handled things, right? Is that I was very, wanted to figure out who I was, but I was constantly pressed down on that to say, no, that's not what you do, right? You need to be proper.
I do. I mean, I obviously understand that there are many families that are large families where there are, many children. I guess as a father, though, I do struggle to understand the mentality of, let's have as many children as possible. And I can't help but wonder whether your mother's enthusiasm for you to get married was, and again, feel free to correct me because I don't want to second guess anyone's personality, but it's almost like, we have this production line of children and we kind of need to move them along and get them set up so that, we have fewer mouths to feed or fewer people to think about. So I just don't understand viewing children in that way, as though they're almost like it's almost like a collection,
I would say that for my mother, who I would consider to be broken, used her children as a way as to be her friends.
Right.
The more children she had, the more she felt she herself was adopted as a child, and she was not born into becoming a Jehovah's Witness. She found it when she was like 19 years old. She walked into the Kingdom Hall and they came to her. And I think she was at a point in her life where she felt incredibly lonely, didn't know her family heritage like we can today and go on 23andMe and see where things are at. She had no clue. And I think that she was just at a different portion in her life. But getting to the point of children, I know my mother told me a story and she said, Kim, I had 3 children before I even knew what birth control was. She was in the Kingdom Hall and she had passed out with her 4th child, middle brother. And she said one of the, ladies in the congregation said, do you know about birth control? And she said, what's that? So my mother had no clue even to know what that was back then. I'm 48, right? So my mom has passed away, but she would be in her 80s right about now. And that was, kind of the thing back then. Nobody talked about sex. Nobody talked about any of that, including birth control pills. So she basically had told me when I was very young, like, we had 4 children before I even knew what that was. And they thought that they would have one more later on in life, and they got a surprise because they got 2.
Wow. Okay. So suffice to say, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds to me like you're describing a fairly dysfunctional family that is kind of relying on religious position and religious status within the local community to kind of compensate for various deficiencies. Would that be fair?
Yes, I think that they were both just thinking in terms. My father was actually raised as a Jehovah's Witness, and for him, I think that they were both just trying to actually struggle with the fact that this is what they should be doing, that this is something that they want to do. And I do believe that they thought in some ways that they were doing the right thing, but we were also, with my father in a very controlling environment, but I do think that being in a small community in Canada, I grew up in a town of 10,000 people, might even been less back then. And that type of community, I think that you're just relying on the people that are around you. And I don't believe that they even knew much about socially and about other people. And, my mom kept quite content being, where she was, just being busy raising children and going to the Kingdom Hall and going out in service. Yeah. That was, what we did.
So you, unfortunately, have kind of firsthand knowledge of the really kind of dark side of this group. And I'm wondering, to the extent that you feel able to share that information, whether you're able to, tell us more about that so that people can understand,
sure,
more of these issues if they don't perhaps know much about Jehovah's Witnesses.
So I know that you have mentioned before about people that have been sexually abused in the organization. And, I think everybody agrees that it happens and that they know, but at the end of the day, sharing a person's story, I think, is really important. And that's basically where I'm at in my life. Everybody, even though I have left 16 years ago and I have a completely different life, it was very, you just think it's just me. It's you have no idea who is out there and who's experienced the exact same thing until people are sharing their story. And then when they do, you kind of look and you go, oh my gosh, that happened to me and I'm not alone. And I think that's where this important part of this has to happen, where we do need to share our stories and be vulnerable and say, you know what, this is the truth. And I'm just going to tell it as it is. I was 4 years old when I was being sexually abused by an older brother of mine. At that age, at 4, it's, just kind of learning about someone who's giving you attention and spoiling you and, getting a connection with someone. So someone who is being sexually abused doesn't know it, especially as a child, they don't, right? So you're in this world and you start to kind of realize, well, this person treats me really special. And that's what you're related, to at that time. But when I was 8 years old, my parents were leaving the house and my brother was kind of in and out. He was, kind of in the house and then he'd be gone. And I didn't understand at the time where he was. And I was kind of like, where did he go? And my parents had said, oh, he went to Bethel, which is what my oldest brother did as well. And he was going to Bethel to help out with the renovation in Toronto at the time. And this would be in like 1983. And so when he was helping, he wasn't going to be living in Bethel, but he was going to be helping with some construction or something that was going on at the time. And he had been gone for just a little while. And during that time while he was gone, I started to realize with my father and with my other siblings, a moment where I was like, this isn't normal. Why am I missing him so much? Why is this? And I started to have to deal with the, that separation almost that was there. And I didn't think a whole lot about it, but we had went up north towards Muskoka. We have some property up there. And so we were up there and we had went away on vacation. And when we had returned, his vehicle was in the driveway. And I instantly started to have a panic. I knew at that exact moment, this isn't right. I knew that at that point I could feel it. But, we went in and my family was kind of talking about what was going on. And my parents leave every week to go out to eat. It was their thing that they did. And my mom went to go leave. And I don't remember this actually at the time, but she had told me when the abuse had come out that I had grabbed her leg and I had begged her and I said, Mom, don't go, please don't go. And she said that she looked at me and she knew something was wrong, but she wasn't quite sure. And they had left to go to this restaurant and they had gotten to the parking lot. Apparently they got into the restaurant, and how my mother had described this is that she said, Kim, I just knew something was wrong. So I told your father. We got in the car and we drove home. And they came in unexpectedly and I was downstairs. And he had already started to have me undressed. And so he was already at that point where we were, practically at that point being very intimate. And I was scared. And I heard the door and I knew it was my parents. And I flew off that bed and I ran up the stairs and I went into the bathroom and I'm just like rocking because I was soothing myself, just rocking. And my mom says, what's wrong? What's wrong? And she's like, tell me what's wrong. And she got to my level and she said, Kim, did he touch you? And I said, yes. And my dad was in the doorway at this point and he flew down the stairs and you heard yelling and screaming and banging. And my mom got me ready. It was around dinner time, but she said, take a bath. So I had to take a bath. And then she put me in the room and she's like, stay in your room. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, something's wrong. What's wrong? And I look out the window and I see garbage bags and I see all sorts of stuff out in the driveway. But as a child, I'm thinking, did I do something wrong? Are they going to get rid of me? So I went and I hid in my closet. And it was the safest place I could be. And I sat in the closet and I just waited. It was like, are they coming? Are they coming? What's going on? And I heard people in the house and I was like, oh, okay, this is weird. And I had opened up the door and I go down the hallway and the elders had come into the home. And in our front living room, that's where they sat. And that was our family room where people come to visit. And my mom was making a pot of coffee and I just looked and I knew, okay, back out. And so I slowly went back into my room and I stayed there. And later on, it was getting dark out and my father had come into the room and he sat on my bed and he said, Kim, your brother has been disfellowshipped. And right then and there, I felt so good. I was like, Jehovah knows. The elders know. I just knew at that point, and all I cared about at that time was that it stopped, right? So when it stopped as a child, that's all you want. There's nothing else. You don't know about future. You don't know about, PTSD. You don't know about any of that stuff. You just wanted to stop and it stopped. And so at that point, I felt very good. I felt very validated. I felt, just he's gone and things are good. And, I internalized some things because I was going through a huge loss at that time. He was reinstated, as I'm sure you know. Reinstatements happen very quickly, sometimes 6 months, 9 months. And he came to the meetings and we were in the same congregation. So even though he was not there in the home, he was still there, but I still felt safe because at that time I was like, the elders know, so it's good, it's fine. But when he was reinstated, I was sitting in the Kingdom Hall and my father had told me that he was being reinstated. And he said, when this is done and everybody comes and congratulates at the end of the meeting, like it's, a big reward or whatever. And my father had said to me, I want you to go and I want you to give him a hug. And it broke my heart because I knew with our family that it was to be an example and to forgive. But the hardest part for me in the forgiveness part was that God forgave him and I didn't. And so that was the moment in my life that I was like, there's something wrong with me, because God forgave him. And so I struggled at a very young age with that, on top of losing somebody who treated me so nicely. He taught me how to eat popcorn and find the kernels at the bottom of a bowl and eat the crunchy ones. And he taught me how to blow bubbles with bubble gum. And he played with us, with Kelly and I. And you struggle with those things as you're going into this, as you get older, because you have to go back and you have to recognize that this is not my fault. And that there's nothing wrong with me, that this was a situation and it was something that happened to me. But until you get to that point in your life, all you think about is that there's something wrong with you. And so he had come back and, I struggled with it, but it didn't matter because for me, I said, the elders know. The elders know. Jehovah knows. Jehovah will deal with whatever it is. And so then I was constantly focusing on myself and trying to figure out what's wrong with me at that point. As I got a little bit older, and obviously, grooming for marriage and all those different things, I had gotten married and I had told my husband when we were dating, I said, there's something that I have to tell you. And he said, what? And I said, I don't think I'm a virgin. And he was like, what? And I said, I have to tell you this because I felt very strongly about it during a meeting. And it was during a Kingdom Hall meeting where the elder had talked about the book of Deuteronomy. And a woman who screams in the field is safe, right? She will not be stoned to death because she screamed. And there's that passage in there that was very powerful for me because...
Which was actually used by Angus Stewart with Jeffrey Jackson. And
yeah. And in that passage, I had realized that if it was me and I had gotten married, I felt very much I would be stoned to death.
Right.
And so that was the moment in my life that I knew whoever I was going to marry, I needed to tell them. Because I only had the Bible to look at, right, as examples. So I didn't know if someone was going to come and say, okay, I need to see if you're a virgin or not. What does that mean? I didn't know any of that stuff. I was relying on the scripture to say that. And there was nothing in the scripture that would tell somebody who is abused, you're just a child, you didn't scream. You know what I mean? That you're safe. And so I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. So when I had gotten married, I had told him. And, I remember reassuring him and he's like, I hate that guy. And I was like, it's okay. It's okay. Yes, he's still my brother. Yes, he's very much in our life. And he had been disfellowshipped again and he had come back again. And he was actually dating someone and getting married the same time I was, believe it or not. And it was his second marriage. And I was like, it's fine. It's fine. I'm okay. Just know that I'm okay. And if I'm okay, you should be okay. And he's like, okay. He's like, I can deal with that. I still want to punch him in the face, but, I could deal with that. And, when I had gotten married, my father had gotten cancer right around the same time, stage 4. And I had never ever spoken about this to my parents. It wasn't something he did. And my father had just been told that he's no longer on a clinical trial, that he's going to die. I'm married and he's sitting there and he's like, yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened to you in Sarnia. And I was like, what do you mean Sarnia? You mean Petrolia, where I was born? And he was like, what do you mean Petrolia? And I was like, Dad, it started when I was like 4 years old. And the look on his face was just, he went white. And I thought he was going to be sick. And I was like, that's weird. You know, at the end of the day, okay, but I don't know what to do. And so then I was reassuring my father, it's okay, Dad. It's okay, Dad. I'm fine. Fine. Just look at me and you know that I'm fine. And if I'm fine, you should be fine. And that's where I was in my life. And he had passed away, didn't, really, went through having children. I had miscarried a few children and I had my daughter and then my son. This is in 2003 was born and I had missed some of the meetings. And I was very open my entire life from the time I was 12, 13, 14, didn't matter. All my friends who knew me knew that I was sexually abused. I told them, but I also told them that the elders had disfellowshipped him and he had been reinstated. And so no different, because anybody who wants to know me, I was that person that said, I got something I need to tell you. I don't know why, but I always felt like I had to. I felt like there was this secret that I needed to get off my chest so that I could connect with somebody. And I just had my son and I had missed a couple of meetings, and a girlfriend of mine sitting in the Kingdom Hall. And she said she instantly thought of me, and she came and she visited and she said, said hello to my newborn baby boy. And she said, Kim, there was a letter that was read in the congregation, and the elder had read about it because of everything that was happening with the Catholic Church about sexual abuse. And that was coming out at the time. The elder read a letter that said, the organization has made a decision to anybody who's been sexually abused, anybody who's even had some sort of accusation, would never be a ministerial servant, would never be an elder, would never be put in as an example. And she knew my brother was a ministerial servant and he was about to become an elder. And so she had come to me and she said, Kim, was he removed? And I said, I don't know. We live in a different city. I said, I'll have to call my brother. So I call up my brother and I'm like, you're in the same congregation, kind of same Kingdom Hall. Mm. And he was like, no, not that I know of. And I said, well, Kelly is my twin. What do you mean? He was disfellowshipped for something that happened to me, like, being abused. Mm. And he's like, Kim, what are you talking about? And I realized I never had a conversation about this, even with my own twin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he was trying to get facts, like what's going on. And, and I was like, okay, I don't have time for this, right? I'm validated with what happened to me. So I'm just going to skip the conversation I'm having with you. I'll fill you in later. And I got off the phone. And I was like, I told my husband and he's like, something's not right. And I'm like, hey, let's not jump to conclusions here. I'm going to go to the only person I know in the Kingdom Hall that I feel comfortable enough, an older elder. He was friends with my father growing up. I'm going to go to him and I'm going to ask him. So my husband and I walked up to him and I said, there was a letter that I had missed and I just want to understand what this letter is all about. And he says, oh my God. He's like, please tell me this isn't about your brother. And I'm like, how do you know? And he's like, I was afraid of this because he's like, he did something to your sister. And my whole world changed at that moment, because in that moment, I knew my sister was older than me. She 14 years older than me. So when this abuse had happened, I knew right then and there that my abuse could have been prevented. Mm.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do with that. And I went to my sister and she told me what had happened to her. She wasn't treated well in this situation with her. And I can't talk about her in the sense that that's her story. But I mean, I look at the situation and I think, I deserve the truth. I deserve to know at that point what's going on. And so we had went to the elders, and I did what I was supposed to do. I confronted him. I went to my hometown. I sat with the
When
elders.
you say you were supposed to do, did they ask you to confront him?
Yes, that is part of the, basically any accusation in sexual abuse. So anybody who's gone through this would know that the elders will ask you questions, and they write their notes. You never see what those notes are, but they're writing these notes. And then they ask the person to face their abuser in their congregation with their elders.
I think that the very latest guidelines have kind of watered that down a little bit. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Not in 2003.
Exactly. Yeah.
So and things have changed, and we can get into why those have changed. And 9 times out of 10, it's because of people like me. Who have come forward and said this wasn't right.
But the point is, you were asked by your elders as a child sexual abuse survivor to confront your abuser, and that is itself. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. That's a traumatizing experience, isn't it?
Yes, because I had to tell the elders very explicit details. How many times? What do you remember? What did he do? And they also asked me to have my husband. I said, I don't want my husband in the room when I tell you the things that he did. And they were like, no, you have to have your husband in the room. And I had looked at him and I begged him and I said, I don't want you to look at me differently. I don't want you to know. To this day, he realizes that my request was I didn't want him there. And he's apologized to me for that, because it did change. It changed our relationship completely. And I had to tell very explicit details. And it's like opening Pandora's box, right? Because now you're kind of going into those explicit details, and I haven't really talked about it with anybody to that extent. Not even my closest friend would even know to what extent. And but anyways, so we had drove to my hometown, and we sat there, and the 3 elders were there with him, and they read a letter of accusation, because that's what they did back then. And they had asked him, are you denying anything that's in this? And the whole time that it was being read, he just had his head down and he was staring at the floor. And he looked at me and he said, I'm surprised you remember so much. That was his comment to me. And I said, do you deny what was being said? And he said, no, if that's what you remember. But he's like, at the same time, there was excuses, and he was giving excuses about how he was on drugs. So he doesn't really remember. And I said, there are drunk people. There are people that have been on drugs. And, I was relating to one of our uncles who was the happy drunk. But, and I said, there are things that come out.
There are plenty of drunks that don't manage to not sexually abuse children. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it brings out the worst in you. If it lowers your inhibition, then what is the true self that's coming out, and what are those things? And that's exactly what I was trying to prove to him, that I was like, I know lots of people and none of that would happen, right? So I realized that there was excuses, and I had told the elders that I said, well, what are you going to do about this? And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, he lied based on omission. So what I had discovered when he was disfellowshipped when I was a child is that he was on drugs, and there was other things that were disfellowshipping offenses. And so one of the elders had said to me, if he was disfellowshipped for this much, and whether it's this much, he still was disfellowshipped. So to the degree, the worst, like the highest degree of what we could do is disfellowship him. So I said, I understand that, but he lied, because when I spoke to the elder who had the record of disfellowshipping, which disfellowshipping should carry a letter with that person from congregation to congregation.
Letter of recommendation.
Sexual abuse wasn't in there. And the reason why, at least they told me it wasn't, But when the letter actually was read, which later on was read to me, said that there was a sheet between us. And I was like, why would you put in a letter of record that there was a sheet between us? That doesn't even make sense. And I was like, what's going on? This doesn't make sense. So in this meeting, when I was having this confrontation with him, I said to him, you lied by omission, because even if you, by your statement, is that there was a sheet between us, what about from the time from 4 until I was almost 8 years old when there was no sheet? Even if that's what you recall. So I had asked the elders actually at that time, are you going to disfellowship him? Because at the end of the day, he's lied for all these years. You disfellowship for lying, supposedly. So why wouldn't you disfellowship him? Well, he's coming clean. I said, he's not coming clean. I'm forcing this situation to happen. And I was very upset. And I was so upset at the point that I said to them, I may report this. I have the right. I have looked into the statute of limitations, and I know I have the right to report my abuse. Oh, did that ever change? So the attention on him now focused on me. And they started to read me scriptures after scriptures of how to forgive and to rely on God to be the judge. And whatever's not settled in my heart now will be dealt with
the black
through
sheep
God.
because you were talking about going to the authorities.
Yes. And they made it very clear, because my husband was with me, they're not coming. If you want to report it, they said, if you want to report it, you have every right to do so. But you're no longer a child, you see. So we don't need to report it. And I said, what about back then when you should have? So I said, I'm going to make some decisions about whether I'm going to report or not. And I felt very perplexed at the time because of the guilt that was placed on me. And it was very clear that if I did, it was not welcoming. It was not approval. They even said that they wouldn't come with me. They wouldn't even, basically, when you go to court, subpoena us. I dare you. And it broke my heart.
They said subpoena us.
The only way that it's going to happen is subpoena. Subpoena. Because they would not come forward. Not at all.
They told you as a child sexual abuse survivor that they were unwilling to cooperate with the legal process. They would not come forward. And that has been proven for decade after decade. Since even 2003. If you've looked at other sexual abuse cases in court, you know where they sit? Oh, yeah.
They sit either in the middle or on the side of the accused. And they did that in court. My mother and my family sat in the middle because, they didn't know what to do. And, at the end of the day, I lost the support of them. Again, I'm struggling, right? I'm struggling with what's wrong with me, and all of that stuff. So my son was about 10 months old. So from 2 weeks of birth to 10 months, I was struggling with what to do. And, it wouldn't go away, the feeling that I had and all this stuff. And we had some family events, and my twin brother, I said, you're having a barbecue and you're asking him to be there, and I don't want him there. I felt like I kind of had a little bit of precedent, right? Like, I'm your twin sister. And if I don't want him there, then why is he there? Like, I'm not going if he's there. And he'd be like, you have to forgive, you have to move on, you have to, you know what I mean? And it was like, so my relationship with my family started to deteriorate drastically. And at that point I was like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And it was in a crisis, I guess. I was going through, all of this. My husband was angry at the time. He wanted to take a baseball bat, right? Like he was just like, this is ridiculous. And that's how guys react. And I was like, you can't be like that because, I don't need you in jail. We have 2 children, you know what I mean? And I'm kind of going through all this stuff. And I had realized I needed help. And I called the crisis line in the middle of the night. I was just at the lowest of lows. And this lady answers on the line and she's like, "Gee, are you feeling suicidal?" And I said, "No." I said, "But I don't know what to do." And we had talked for a little bit and she had calmed me down and we booked an appointment with the Sexual Assault Crisis Center. And it was the first time I had a therapist. It was the best thing I ever did because they teach you how to cope because you don't know how to cope, right? So coping skill is not rely on God and pray about it and fix yourself. That's not a coping skill, right? So to learn how to cope with these feelings, I started to write them down and acknowledge them. And that was a big change for me. We were in the group and I'm still friends with some of the girls that are in the group. And the therapist had us all close our eyes and kind of, imagine a time when you really felt vulnerable and you felt alone. And I want you to go back to a space that's just you and whatever floats into your head. I just want you to accept that image. And the image that had come to me, I was about 5 years old and I was sitting on the back of the fence and I was like looking at the clouds and listening, to birds and all that kind of thing. And for some reason I had this image and I was like, I remember the next door neighbor girl coming and sitting beside me. And she's a couple years older than me. That I knew. And she sat beside me and we had this conversation and she didn't want to be in the house and neither did I. I didn't want to be in the house for my reasons, but she didn't want to be in her house for her reasons. And her father was a drunk and a mean drunk. And so her and I had developed a little bit of a relationship with each other. I had just this image was coming through and I was like, okay, what a weird way to have this come in. And, the therapist is like, okay, I want you to go back. And I'm thinking about how I'm like 5 years old and I'm this little girl and I feel as this little girl. And she's like, I want you to come now to yourself around the corner. And I want you to see who you are now. And I want you to look at that person. And I'm thinking of my 5-year-old self. And I want you to walk up to that little girl and I want you to tell her it's not her fault. It's not her fault. And then that was the first time that I had recognized that I had placed myself as a 5-year-old little girl. See, when you're going through the abuse and you talk about it, you go back to those moments. You're not who you are now. You go through this disassociation that you feel like you're that 5-year-old. And that's exactly how I felt. And it was the first time that I was able to pull myself away from those two and realize this is who I am. I am a grown woman. I have 2 children. And I'm just telling myself when I was a little girl, because no one did that for me. So I'm going to do that for me. That's something that I'm going to do. And it was a very powerful moment. So anybody who wonders about going to therapy and learning coping skills, yes, you will learn those things, but you're also going to learn how to detach yourself from those feelings to protect yourself and to realize that I'm safe, right? I believe in the whole, I work in healthcare and Maslow's hierarchy and, kind of I started to look a little bit into psychology, and each person has to take little bits and pieces of what they believe. But what I started to realize in that part of it was that I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel secure. And if you don't feel safe and you don't feel secure, that's the only thing that's on your mind. You can't even get into connection, belonging, anything else because you're in crises mode. And that's exactly where I was when I had went to the therapist. Why I called the crises line is because that's exactly where I was. And I needed that help. And it was the best thing I ever did, because I didn't have the support of the elders, the congregation. I didn't have support of my family. I felt very much alone. And so by going into the community and looking and saying, I need help, made the difference in the world. And I had went back to school, and, I started to kind of do all sorts of things. And I'm sitting there with my therapist, and I said, I'm going to the police. Believe it or not, therapists don't actually say good for you. They don't. She's like, are you sure? Are you ready to do that? Do you understand? And I said, no, I know I'm going to get a conviction. I know you don't know anything about me and about Jehovah's Witnesses, but I'm going to get a conviction. I know that I'm going to get one. And she's like, well, Kim, less than 4%, some statistic, less than 4% ever get a conviction. And I said, doesn't matter. I know I'm going to get one. And I felt very confident. It's really weird, because at that moment, she's like, are you sure? Do you think? And I was like, no, that's actually the moment of knowing, believe it or not. And I felt very strong about it. And I was like, no. So I drove to our hometown, and I walked into the police, and I was like, so I have something to report about sexual abuse, but I just want you to know it was something that happened to me as a child. So you don't need to kind of like go into crisis mode, just so you know. And so they brought me into a small room, and this lady had come in, the constable, Heather, and great lady. And she said, I just want you to take your time, and I want you to tell me what happened. I'm used to a lot of these kind of cases. So, feel free. So I took my time, and, I'm trying to tell her, and it's, what's going on. And she looked at me and she said, there's not a lot of cases like yours. And I thought, oh God, I thought you did this stuff before. And she's like, there really isn't. She's like, there's been ones in terms of the Catholic Church that have come forward. But as a Jehovah's Witness, what I can tell you is the elders are not going to come forward. And I said, they've already told me that. I already know that. And she goes, really? And I said, yeah. She's like, well, we'll subpoena them. And I said, yeah, they said that would happen. But then when we were talking, I gave her statistics, like, how old I was. My brother was an adult at the time, which I didn't even recognize was a thing. Who did you tell? Well, I told my parents knew, my older siblings know, the elders know, my friends know. It was like, oh my gosh, like all these people know. And it was like, yeah, like, I don't like, that's exactly what happened. And so they had obviously pulled him in, they pulled in the elders. The letter was gone all of a sudden. I grew up with a girlfriend of mine. Her father was the record keeper, and he had files in his room, like filing cabinets, and he was the record keeper. That's what he did. We weren't allowed to play hide and go seek in that room, but he had an office and all these filing cabinets. So I had asked, like, what are these? And they were locked. And it was like, oh, that's where all the letters are. That's where all the, documentation is. And I had told the constable about that. And she said, where? And I said, I can give you the address. He actually read me that letter. And she's like, really? So they got a warrant, and they had went into the house, and their records are gone. And I knew right then and there that they had done their homework.
They'd anticipated the fact that you were going to go to the police.
Yeah.
Do you believe?
And I knew that because after I had met with him in the congregation with his elders who, protected him so fiercely. When I went back to the very first meeting with my husband to talk to the elders who are my elders, who I've already told them such intimate moments of what's happened. And I'm looking for clarification. I'm looking for, maybe they'll support me. They didn't. They're obviously, his elders are supporting him. They'll support me, very optimistic person. And, the elders stopped us right away. And my husband and I looked, and we're like, what's going on? And he's like, I'm so sorry. He says, I can't talk to you. And I'm like, what do you mean you can't talk to me? He's like, we love you. Okay. Why can't you talk to me? It's not me. Just so you know, it's not me. But the Bethel has contacted us and said that they're not allowed to talk to you. We're not allowed to talk to you anymore. And I was like, Bethel? And they're like, the decision has come forward and we've been noted as your elder body. We can no longer speak to you. And I'm like, but you know everything. Like, I've
They've
told you
stopped
everything.
being shepherds because the legal department has swung
That's
into
when
action.
I knew I was the spotted leopard, right? It was no longer about me being a victim. It was me a liability. And I stopped coming to quite a bit of the meetings because I was really hurt. And then elder came and visited us, and my husband right away was like, how dare you, you have, done so much to us in terms of what we've given you. And, we get nothing. And he goes, you know what? It is about a liability, because I called them out on it. And he says, even if you do it, he goes, you'll sue. And I said, what do you mean? Why would I sue? And he says, you will. And he goes, you'll get about $20,000. That's what you'll get from it. And my husband was like, you need to leave. You need to leave our house because you're making this about that. And I didn't realize at the time
basically
that
was mockery, wasn't it? That was mockery.
And a tactic, again, on a guilt trip and everything else, right? And, really at the end of the day, as a victim, what you're looking for is validation. What you're looking for is support. And I wasn't even getting that.
An apology,
Oh, that would never happen.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
And, at the end of the day, I was, anyways, so after I ended up reporting to the police, and, it takes 2.5, 3 years, it went through Superior Court. The Crown Attorney for Canada had, said, you do have a case, and we've done a lot of investigating, and, at the end of the day, we're going to probably have to subpoena the elders, but we want them up in the stand, and we're going to ask them, because they cannot hide under clergy. They cannot. And I said, okay. So, now you're starting to learn a little bit more about the law. And, that was very helpful, because at the time you don't know. So anyways, so as this kind of went through this 2.5, 3 year process, you're basically waiting for that call. And I get the call, and they say, right now is basically the pre-trial. We'll offer maybe a plea bargain. We'll see where things are. So we had went to court, and the Crown Attorney actually came to me and said he wants to plea bargain. He's going to plead guilty. And I said, whoa. Okay. And they're like, it's going to be a lesser plea. So you have to understand that even to the degree in 1983, when it was found out, you have to go back to that part of the law. So if the biggest degree, let's say, is 2 years in jail, that's the maximum basically that they can provide at that time, right? So things have changed as well since 2003. More cases are coming forward since then. And this is, again, why it's very important. If you feel you can move forward, do move forward, because you're not just helping yourself, you're helping other people. Okay. And, at the end of the day, I said, well, I'm going to get a conviction. So they had me do my victim impact statement, because I was very wanting the judge to understand to the degree of what I went through. And when I was done, he says, you're very articulate. I was able to understand every aspect of what happened to you. And he's like, it's never going to feel like enough, but he's like, I could give him at this point 9 months in jail because he plea bargained, or you could do 2 years house arrest. And he said, I'm going to do 2 years house arrest because I believe it's going to hurt him more if he's home. He can't go anywhere. I said, okay. And I was like, whatever, I'm looking for validation, right? So at that point, I get my validation, and he's on the sex offenders list. And, I instantly go to the Sarnia News Observer, and I'm like, hey, we got this thing. And they said, yeah, you're protected because it was as if you were an 8-year-old. So we can't actually release your name. And I was like, but I'm a grown adult. And if I choose to come forward, why wouldn't I be able to come forward? And they're like, oh, you can. But there wasn't any platform, even in 2003 of whatever. And, this is again why this is important. But, back then it was like I was ready to scream at the top of my lungs and say, look, 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 look. But, there wasn't really much of that around there. And so anyways, so then, I was like, okay, I just worked through therapy and, I went back to school. It was actually during therapy that I had realized that my relationship with my husband wasn't good. I married somebody because I thought that I should marry them and all those things. So it brought up not only the things that were going wrong in my life in those relationships, everybody was under the microscope. And to him, it was very abrupt. And I had picked up the kids and I went into hiatus house because I was actually feeling very unsafe. And that's a whole other story. But I went into hiatus house and I took my two kids and I was like, okay, I don't have a job. I have nothing. They're going to hopefully take care of me. And I'm in this crisis house. And
was it like a shelter?
Yes, for women.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm going to apply to my very first job. I've owned a company with my ex, but I went through homeschooling, right? So like, I didn't feel confident that, and I was like, well, I know how to do like, payroll. And I guess I know how to do this. And I was very, didn't even know what my own worth was, right? So I put myself out there and I did a resume. And I sent it out and I get 3 interviews in 1 week. 3. And another girl that I happened to have met said, you don't need to pay last, just pay first. I have a house for you. It just so happened that this girl had to leave and I have renovated this house. And if you want to move in with these kids, the house is yours. And I signed without even having the money for the next month. Didn't even have a job. And I'm signing for a house going, oh God, let's see what happens. And I got a job. And it was the beginning of my life in figuring out who I was. And I had left in August, and then the court had contacted me, interestingly enough, and said, this is about 2 years since court had went through in 2006. And they said, it's victim services and we would like to have an interview with you. And if you have an interview with you, we'd like to understand what's going on. We do provide some compensation. The most compensation in a court situation is maybe about $25,000. But if you feel like you could come forward, we would like to know more about you. They do that for any conviction. And I was like, okay, well, I lost 6 weeks of pay. I lost 6 weeks of pay at the time. Because I was just trying to work in my first attempt was basically recruiting, like manpower. I don't know what you would, but like basically I had no job. So I was willing to work a temp job. So I walked into this temp company and, but anyways, at the end of the day, I go and I sit there and I tell them that I've left my husband. I have 2 children. I'm starting over my life. I want to go back to school. I don't even know what that looks like. And I look up and there's like 5 of them, but they're bawling, like, why are these bawling? And they're like, you're being very brave. And I was like, I just know what I need to do. I feel freer now than I did then. And I know that I'm on the right path. And I was awarded $18,000 and it gave me enough to think, oh my gosh, I can do this, right? Like I can do this on my own. And I started to date and, like it's just a whole world. I wish, in terms of it, there's got to be more of these conversations, honestly, about the awkwardness of it all when you're kind of going through this world. And there are actually a few books out there, but it's, there were some awkward moments and boundaries, right? You have to learn now what are boundaries and, maybe a person in, a birthday doesn't want to hear about how you were sexually abused and that you were raised as a Jehovah's Witness and they're sitting there drinking a beer and they're like, okay, what do I say?
Yeah.
But at the time you're just trying to figure out who you are, right? So there, that happens, and that's okay too. Anybody that happens to, do not beat yourself up on it, because what you need to recognize is that you are looking for connection. That's what you're looking for, a sense of belonging, a sense of, and it's very difficult. 16 years later, yes, I have a huge whole bunch of friends. I got the hockey moms, I got married last year. We had 170 people at our wedding. I got lots of friends. But that doesn't mean that I have other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses that can understand and nod. You're nodding as we're talking, because I know you've heard it, you've seen it, you've lived parts of these things in your life. And that's what's important too, is the understanding the sense of connection. And that's exactly where, if someone's at that, don't feel awkward about it. Realize that maybe there's another avenue. Maybe there's someone else that I can reach out to, and, a community. And I've been on some of these community things though, too. Right. And, some of them are venting, some of them are, silly jokes, some of them, but once in a while, you'll see a genuine person who's hurting. And, you might be able to offer your experience or something that's there. And it does help you to realize, hey, I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. There are so many other people like me. And that's where I'm at, just beginning in my life, is to say, you know what? I have this children. I have a whole other life, but there is still a part of me that's missing that understanding, because no matter how hard someone tries, they don't. They can't. They didn't live it. And that's okay. But don't expect people to fully understand what it's like. Instead, I've found a few of people that I'm like, we're now in our own little bit of a community. And maybe that will grow over time. But you have to share your story. If I don't share my story and you don't know that, and other people don't know that,
it's a bit of a trial and error process as well when you're establishing a community, because you're going to make friends and you're going to lose friends as well. And it's two steps forward, one step back, and all that kind of thing. Yeah. Right. So
I have been, and I'm sure, and we'll kind of see, but at the end of the day, I've been very open about it in my own internal. So there is nobody that isn't close to me that don't know me. They know about the conviction. They know that I was abused. They know about those things. And I don't talk about them in detail or those, but I definitely let them know and say, this is a part of who my past. It doesn't define me, right? It does not define me. But it is a part of my history. And by acknowledging that, I feel like in some ways, it's like you stand in your own power and say, you know what, I am okay. And, it isn't until you leave that you realize, oh my gosh, there's a lot of really nice people and good people out there. They are not running with Satan, the devil. And you know what I mean? Like, you kind of think like, oh, these people are scary, evil, whatever it is you want to say. And you're like, oh, gee, like, they just take their kids to hockey or to soccer, or, you know what I mean? And on the weekend, and they just want to crack open a beer or have a drink and have a conversation. You know what I mean? Barbecue. We're not necessarily in this world where we think, gosh, scary, right? Like when you're younger, again, you're looking at the Bible and you're looking at all of these things and you're trying to put things into perspective. But getting
there's
back
definitely
to
life on the other side, I think is what you're saying. Yeah.
Absolutely. There is. And, since 2017, turning into 2018, Leah Remini kind of started to do stuff, right, with the Scientology. And I see on TV and they're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. And you know how when they're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses, they use certain words. You're like, that's a word no Jehovah's Witness would use. That's not right. And part of it is because the news is doing their best to describe something that they don't know. Internally, if you either know it or you don't know it, right?
Yeah.
And I God bless them for a lot of people have become educated about it. and they do it. But at that time, I was like listening to certain things and I was like, and I was like, unless you actually do something about it, there's Leah Remy. The reason why I'm putting this out there is because she did an interview and she said, God, I wish more Jehovah's Witnesses were brave. They need to come forward. If there's anything that they need to do, is to just start talking and become brave. And if they can do that, you'd be surprised what would happen, right?
Yeah.
And that's when I actually looked into class actions for the first time. And I realized there was a class action in Toronto for Ontario. And then, if you look up class actions in your area, and, in Canada, there was one for Quebec in 2018-ish, somewhere in there. And then one had happened for Ontario. So you have to do it within your area. And I saw basically a lawyer website and I thought, and I clicked on it. And they said, do the elders know? Yes. Was there ever a conviction? Did you report? Which you don't need to in a class action. But I'm like, yes. And so I basically at that point was like, man, what's going on? Like, I need to start thinking about my life and kind of like, what do I want? And again, I think that's everybody. And so anyways, I joined this class action and nothing's happened with it. And then all of a sudden it was coming up for certification. So in Ontario, it's coming up for certification just now. Then what that means is once it becomes certified, basically it becomes locked down, the people that have signed up. So when I talked to the lawyer's office just to see where things are, they said there's a huge list, huge. And I was like, oh, they're like, we can't tell you the number. Wow. Huge list. And I was like,
for a forthcoming class action lawsuit
action in Ontario, huge list of people all signing up. So I was like,
excellent.
Wow, really?
Well, I mean,
yeah,
excellent that something's being done about it, but tragic that there even are that many whose lives have been who've been traumatized by their experience.
Yeah. And there's pros and cons, right? Like, so like when you're going through the court system and you do civil at the time in 2003 was that you had 2 years to sue. And if you don't sue within the 2 years, you can't sue through civil litigation at all.
So when can we expect to hear more about the class action?
So right now, it's going under what's called certification. Class actions can take up to 10 years.
Right.
to finalize. What happens is once it's becomes certified, it will be like in the news through Toronto. And when that happens, basically they're going to line all the people up and a certain amount of money comes out basically out of it, right? It's like, oh, you got a conviction, probably on a little bit of a higher end. If somebody who didn't, know. But at the end of the day, you are collectively saying that this is in fact happened. And what you're relying on is that you have no lawyer's fees. You're going to go in and you're basically going to have to probably be in a room and talk about it, but you're not going to have to be like in front of the court and doing all of those things, right? So there's a little bit of the alleviation of understanding like I can stay anonymous and I can still do this. And that's something that I want to do, right? There's pros and cons. But what people also need to know is you don't have to do the class action. And I'm surprised because I didn't know that. But again, it's about putting yourself out there. It's about, being able to, if you can, share your story because someone else, I don't know, maybe they'll look at that and say, I'm glad, right? Share your story. If you can't, that's okay too. Because maybe you're just not right now ready to, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to be in a year or 2 years or whatever. Because I wasn't ready to tell my story until now. And it's been since 2003.
Well, I'm very, very grateful that you have shared your story. And I'm sure many of my viewers will find it incredibly inspiring. I do have just, a couple more questions and then we'll have to wrap up. Just some housekeeping. You mentioned about not knowing that you could that you don't have to be in the class action lawsuit.
That's right.
Does that mean that you've withdrawn from the class action lawsuit?
Yes, I've opted out.
Okay.
I opted out, and the next step kind of coming up is with my lawyer. We are talking about contacting like the news in Toronto and at least doing some sort of a public statement.
Yeah.
You know, and really at the end of the day, it is a person's choice and what they want to do. And at least know there's options, right?
Sure,
You can't, it doesn't hurt for them to ask.
Yeah. Okay. So you are pursuing, you know, legal remedies, but just not as a part of the class action.
Correct.
And the final question I have, and you know, really, you've given so much during our conversation, in terms of you know, words of inspiration for people who find themselves in a similar situation to you already. But if you could just kind of summarize for anyone who's watching who particularly has suffered trauma due to their experience in Jehovah's Witnesses and feels helpless, as though, you know, that there's nothing that they can do about it, what would be your advice to them?
Stand in your power, because if you are willing to tell the truth and you can stay, it's going to only come back to you in a good way. There are things that, yes, you had mentioned that sometimes you might lose some people, but those people were not in your corner in the first place. And you are going to find other people that are going to be 10 times stronger to be able to support you in the way that you actually need. Stand in your truth. And if you can say, even if it's to a close friend, even if it's just to your husband, even if it's just to someone, starting the conversation is extremely important, because it's going to lead you through a path where you're going to be able to find that healing. I look back on this, honestly, and I have no regrets, and I am not afraid. And a lot of people might say, aren't you afraid? Because I'm not, because I know now who I am. But if I didn't take those first steps, I would never have known who I am, right? If I was always afraid and never did. So try to take those steps forward if you can, because, you know, I just stand in your truth.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kim. You are an inspiration and a very, very brave and courageous woman. And I really appreciate you sharing your story, and congratulations on forging a life for yourself, in which you've, like you said, taken back your power. So thank you. I have.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I certainly have. Don't forget that you can watch similar conversations by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you for watching.